If there's one thing that really pisses me off every time I speak Spanish on the internet, it's people trying to teach me the politically correct way to speak it. Hi y'all, SnarkyJay cosplay here. I'm making this video as a bit of a follow-up to a video I put out last week about representation and how representation in Hollywood is actually Hollywood's biggest lie. You can go and check that one out if you want to. However, I had a bunch of people making comments, and most of them I think were joking, about why it is that when I speak about Hispanics and Latinos or Latinas, I don't use the word Latinx. Now, if you haven't heard the term Latinx, you're one of the fortunate few. Latinx is a relatively new term, and essentially, it is the new politically correct way to say Latino or Latina. Because in today's culture, using a language that is inherently gendered is apparently incorrect. Now, if you're not super familiar with Spanish, let me give you a quick lesson. So everything in Spanish is essentially gendered. A table is la mesa because it's femenina. La is also a feminine term. You would say el libro, which means the book. El is he, or the in this case, and libro ends in O because it's a masculine term. So mesa and libro are female and male, even though they're not human, right? And they have no sex/gender. That's just the way the Spanish language works. There is not an alternate way to say table and book where it wouldn't be gendered. That's just the way the Spanish language works. And quite frankly, it's been inoffensive for thousands of years until recently. So we have folks now trying to say Latinx so that they don't have to call you or anything Latino or Latina. They want to degender the language so that it's more inclusive to folks of different gender identities. I think that's great. We should all be super inclusive, and we can be, quite frankly, as inclusive as we'd like to be, as long as we stop trying to teach Hispanic and Latin people how to fucking speak their language. The Spanish language has sat untouched and uninfluenced for thousands of years. There are tons of different dialects. I'm Cuban Puerto Rican, and both of those Spanishes are different. I tried dating a Chilean man once, and I could barely understand what the fuck he was saying. I've got a friend in Spain who's a great crafter, and I once told him he's un bárbaro, which to Cuban people means like you're a fucking champ. That's crazy. But literally it means you're a barbarian, and he was borderline offended until I explained that I'm Cuban and this is the context in which I meant it. So we're a beautiful melting pot of various dialects and cultures. That's what being Hispanic, Latino, Latina is all about. It's not about having white people come and tell us that our language is non-inclusive. Now, I did do some research about Latinx to try to understand where it came from, and there really isn't an easy way to pinpoint where exactly it came from, but I can tell you, as somebody who speaks Spanish on a daily basis, I speak Spanish at home with my family, and I basically grew up speaking Spanish. I personally have never encountered a single person in my city that was willing to use the word Latinx or accept it as an acceptable term, and that's the f***ed up part that I find amusing, is that I'm being told that Latinx is the correct term by people that are neither Hispanic nor Latino or Latina. And I want to point something out here. We've had a cultural shift historically where now instead of praising colonizers, we instead shed light on the things that they've done, right? The Spaniards were dedicated colonizers, prolific colonizers, and for that reason there's so much Spanish from Spain, specifically blood running through my veins, because they made great strides to lay roots. Now, in case you're unaware of the history of colonization, Puerto Rico was not filled with Spanish-speaking people. We had Taínos and other natives who essentially had their own language. The same happened in Cuba, and when the Spaniards came in and brought their own languages and stuff like that, essentially the same thing happened over there that happened here in the States. They changed the dynamics of the population through various different methods, but the people that were left alive basically got taught to speak Spanish. I find it fascinating how a society that now so vehemently attacks colonialism and colonialists and is so ashamed by the idea that colonizers could have taken somebody else's land and forced them to speak a different language, which I'm not saying is justifiable at all. But I mean, if you think that's really wrong, what is the difference between Spanish colonizers telling Tainos that they were speaking a language wrong and a bunch of white people on Twitter telling me that I'm speaking the language of my people incorrectly because somehow it's not inclusive? And I also would like to point out that in trying to make our language more inclusive, they have also made it that much more difficult to say, because the X sound in Latinx is not really something we use in Spanish. Latinx. I've never heard anybody in Spanish say Latinx. So at the end of the fucking day, not only have you come and bastardized our language, but you've also excluded us from being able to easily pronounce it. On top of that, Spanish is not even that gendered, because if you're talking about a group, you would just say ellos, which defaults to male but is also neutral. Just like when I go visit my grandparents, if I don't want to say voy a ver abuelo y abuela, I would just say voy a ver a mis abuelos, which doesn't mean I have two abuelos, it just means that that's the plural. It's really not that difficult. If you use the word Latinx unironically, you are genuinely discrediting the entire history of Latinos and Latinas and Hispanic culture. You are telling us that our language is offensive to you. You are telling us that it is not correct. You are telling us that it is somehow unacceptable, which is honestly both colonizer mentality and super politically incorrect, because how are you gonna look at a culture that doesn't belong to you and tell me I'm using it wrong? So to recap, Latinx is a bullshit term adopted and proliferated by people burdened with white guilt who feel it's their job to save us, Latinos and Latinas, from ourselves and from our own despicable language, which is somehow so non-inclusive to people in all sorts of communities that we now need to be taught how to speak it correctly so we don't risk offending people. So if you're still on the fence about whether or not you should be using the term Latinx, don't just say Latino, Latina, or Latinos. Just pick one. It's not that f***ing hard. Please, I can't take it anymore. And that's all from me. I've been SnarkyJay. Thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. For more SnarkyJay, be sure to check me out on Instagram. And if you'd like to support me, this channel, and my content creation, do check out and consider subscribing to my Patreon for exclusive photo shoot sets and cosplay content. I'll add links to all of those in the description below. And let me know your thoughts on the Latinx term in the comments below.